Hi there and welcome to a new tutorial. Today we will see how to work with frame-by-frame animations in Moho. So, let's get started. Okay, to start we will go to File, Project Settings, and then we will adjust the size of our project. 1820 by 1080 will be fine. Before starting any animation, always remember to check the size of the project before starting. But what is the frame rate? Frame rate is the frequency at which consecutive images or frames are captured or displayed. It's usually expressed as frames per second or FPS. So if a video is captured and played back at 24 FPS, that means each second of video will show 24 distinct still images. The speed at which they're shown tricks your brain into perceiving smooth motion. For example, 24 frames per second is the standard for movies and TV shows, and it was determined to be the minimum speed needed to capture video. 30 frames per second has been the standard for television since the early days and is still widely used. And 60 FPS or anything higher than 30 FPS is mainly used to create slow-motion video or to record video game footage. Choosing a frame rate requires some thought. So, plan all these little details before you start. Okay, to start we are going to create a background for our animation. If you already have an image created in Photoshop, you can import it if you want. I'm going to choose a light gray color, and then I'm going to create a simple background. To create a frame-by-frame animation in Moho, we will simply click on New Layer, and we will choose the option Frame by Frame. As we can see, it is going to create a new layer, which I will call Animation. We now have what appears to be a blank layer with one vector layer inside. Now, this vector layer has nothing on it. Let me click this empty layer. We will see that nothing happens on the left of our timeline. If I click on the background layer, nothing happens either. But if we click on the frame-by-frame layer, we will see that 3 buttons will appear on the left of our timeline. So, we will have the new frame button, the delete frame button, and the duplicate frame button. Remember that to display these 3 buttons, you must always select the frame-by-frame layer. Okay, let's click on the new frame button to start. As you can see, we now have a frame followed by a long frame next to it. We also have a new vector layer in our layer panel. Okay, let's draw something simple to test how it works. I'm going to draw a simple ball. I'll paint it and adjust the edges just a little bit. Okay, in my case I am going to start the animation by placing my object on the ground. That will be my first frame. Okay, here we have 2 options. We can click on Create a new frame or duplicate the current frame. If I create a new frame, I would have to draw the ball again. In this case, I will simply click on Duplicate Frame. As you can see, now we have our second frame with the ball, and I don't have to draw it again. At the same time, we will see that a new layer has been created. Now, let's start creating an animation. My intention is to get the ball off the ground, and for that, I am going to start stretching it a little bit. I'm going to click again on the duplicate frame, and I'll continue my animation. We can navigate our timeline at any time to see how the first movement is created. Okay, I'm going to continue duplicating and adjusting each new layer. Once the ball is at its highest level, we can make it fall following the same process. As you can see, now we have a 33-frame animation. There are 2 very important things to keep in mind about animations: timing and spacing. These 2 things will help us to have more fluid animations. It is recommended that you understand these concepts before you start creating animations. For example, using the same ball, I'm going to make it jump. But this time, I will leave some static frames before starting the animation. And right before drawing the jump, I will make it shrink a little bit. That will give the feeling that it is gathering strength for the jump. Unlike the previous animation, that simply lifts off the ground, we will see that the second example looks more natural. Having a better idea of these concepts, we can now start working on more complex animations. So, in my case, I made one with Bart Simpson, and here we have him sitting on the table next to a glass of milk. This is an animation of about 285 frames, and as you can see in my layer panel, inside the frame-by-frame folder, I have every drawing of each frame. Some layers are vector layers, and others, as you can see, are folders. Both options are possible. It all depends on the animation and the complexity of the character or scene that you are working on. Here, as you can see, I separate the vector layers in yellow and the folders in blue. In my case, to achieve a more fluid animation, I repeated several frames on the timeline, joined them and separated them by color. The first few frames, the yellow and orange ones, are single frames. But from frame 53 onwards, I started working with folders. Inside each folder, you will find your character divided into different layers. This makes drawing much more organized. If you are going to use single layers or folders, everything will depend on the character and the scene in which you are working. If we click on the frame-by-frame layer, we will see again our timeline with our animation. If we navigate through our timeline, at the same time we will see where we are in our layer panel. In this scene, I just added a table and a glass of milk. As you can see, all the objects in the scene are outside the frame-by-frame layer. This is because they are fixed objects and they are not included in my character's animation. I drew the glass in 4 different layers. 2 layers to create the glass and its content, and 2 layers only for the lines. I split these objects since the first layers have a transparency. To see this detail, we must do a preview of the scene. Here we can see how the arm can be seen through the glass. Let's see how the animation looks by clicking on play. So, as we can see, he's actually talking. Lip sync can be something that takes a long time. But there are a few ways to make the task a bit easier for us. As you can see, my layer with the audio file is off. If I turn it on, you will be able to see it on the timeline. By doing this, we will be able to see our animation and the voice track at the same time. Let's hear it.
Testify! Testify! Testify!
To add an audio file, and to be more organized, we will simply place ourselves on a layer outside of our animation and click on New Layer, Audio. It will appear in our Layers panel and also in our timeline. On our timeline we have 3 buttons: Channels, Sequencer, and Motion Graph. If we click on the Sequencer option, we will see all the tracks and layers of our animation. You will see that they have the same name and order as in our layer panel. Here we can see our audio files and move them in our timeline. Let's add another file. By doing this, you will be able to add sound effects, songs, and voices.
Testify! Testify! Testify!
You can mute the sound by pressing this button if you need to. If you select the audios in the Layers panel, they will be selected in the timeline. You can rename them, move them, or delete them by clicking here or here. Adding color to the layers or frames helps us to organize our animation even more. To do this, we just have to click on the right square of our layer and simply choose a color. Well, now having the sound in the right place, we can return to our normal timeline by clicking on Channels. In this case, I am going to work on the lip sync of my character's mouth based on the phonemes of my audio file.
Testify!
We have Bart saying, testify, and since he has a happy attitude, the modulation of the mouth tends to a smile. It is important to emphasize the F, since that requires closing the mouth. We start with a happy expression. We go through the closed mouth on the letter F. And we continue with the pronunciation of the letter Y. The sound ends when he claps. It is recommended to draw some kind of guide based on your character's mouth. You can draw several mouths and use them as a guide depending on the letters that the character is going to pronounce. This will help you remember and repeat the shape of the mouth when they speak. Another important detail is to remember the mood of our character. That always influences the expressions. As we can see in this example, if the character is smiling while speaking, the shape of the mouth will be different than if he is sad, angry, or crying, even if he is pronouncing the same word. So, depending on the animation, it is recommended to maintain the same attitude throughout the lip sync. That always helps to give the characters more personality. In Bart's case, I started and ended the animation with a smile. As we saw earlier with the ball example, always remember the timing and spacing. Let's take this example to understand the concept of spacing and timing a little better. In this animation, the time taken for an object to move from point A to point B is referred to as timing. It is basically the space between key frames. And the space between two frames is referred to as spacing. So, in this example, the circles are moving from point A to point B in 1 second, with a linear motion at a rate of 24 frames per second. In linear motion, the distance between each frame is the same. But in the real world, objects doesn't move like that. This is why we need to manipulate the spacing. To make it easier to understand, here I created 3 graphs. We have the example of slow in and slow out, with its animation and the spacing table. Then we have the example of slow in, also with its spacing table. And finally, the example of the slow out graph. To really grasp the concepts of timing and spacing animation, I suggest you to take the time to create your own ball bounces animation. This will get you comfortable with mimicking a real-life ball bounce. Then, review the principles of animation to ensure you have a solid knowledge that will serve you well in your work. Okay, in Bart's animation, as we can see, there is a small reduction in the speed of his movement each time he reaches the extreme left and right while he dances. It is important to create fluid movements. For example, in the case of the hand, we can see that it takes an average of 5 frames for each movement. This will always depend on the speed of the animation you are working on. Let's talk about another important detail about the frame-by-frame animation, and that is the onion skins. Onion skinning basically displays dimmed or outlined versions of the content of surrounding frames. You determine how many of the surrounding frames moho displays. For example, here I have my animation. Let's click on the onion skins button to activate it. As you can see, I am currently at frame 107. And I'm going to go down here and select some onion skin frames. The first thing you will notice when you select these frames is that the further they are from our character, the more transparent they will be. If I navigate the timeline, the frames corresponding to the onion skins will move at the same time. If you deactivate the outlines, you will only be able to see the character's silhouette. If you deactivate the colored fills option, you will be able to see the character in its original color, and if you click on Draw Behind, you will see the character behind the layers. Okay, let's turn off these frames and move to a frame ahead. Let's go to frame 142. We will see that if we select the previous onion frames, they will appear behind our character and in a red color. The behavior of these frames will be the same as we saw previously. If we navigate the timeline, they will move too. If we position our character in the middle and activate the frames on both sides, we will see the frames in red and green. The reds are the frames that come before our current frame, and the green ones will come after. By doing this, you will be able to see through the frames and compare the keyframe and the in-betweens. Draw your character as many times as necessary. Take your time to practice each movement. You can draw your character in different positions: running, jumping, fighting, angry, happy, or crying. This helps to have a better notion of how and what can be done later in the animation. When we are creating an animation, we must understand concepts of time and space, and also the types of shots that we are going to use in each scene. We call this storyboard. In this example, we can see how each shot is drawn before making the final animation. We can see a close-up of the hand about to press a button, a close-up of the characters, an open shot to show where they are, and how the scene is going to end. You can even draw some ideas of what the background would look like with our characters in it. All this helps us to perceive how we are going to develop all our animation later. Here we have an example of the Simpsons storyboard, where we can see the title of the scene, the actions that take place in each scene, the dialogues, and the necessary notes and reminders that can be about the scene, the shot, the dialogue, or an action in particular. Creating animations is a very complex process, and it is extremely important to analyze all the details before starting. From the basic sketch to the detailed movement of a hand, there is a lot to consider. Going back with Bart, I did the animation up to this particular point. All these frames that we see here, I repeated them again. I could create an endless loop with the dancing if I wanted to. So, keep in mind that repeating frames will save you a lot of time. To finish, I would like to talk about one more detail about the frame rate. In this case, I took the real voice of Bart, which is at about 59.53 frame rate. Keep in mind that if your audio and animation have different frame rates, you will have problems. For example, if I put my animation at 24 FPS, the audio file may not appear. And if we increase it, we will have the audio out of place.
Testify! Testify!
Okay, let's see our finished animation.
Testify! Testify! Testify!
Bringing our characters to life is something unique, giving them a personality, and creating a story with them can be a great challenge, but by following the right steps everything can be done. In future videos, we will talk more in detail about how to work with lip sync, special effects, how to create character reels for video games, and much more. Now it is time to practice. Thanks so much for all your support and comments, I really appreciate that. I hope this video has been helpful, and I will see you next time.